I'd like to introduce someone who's very important to the Rock Center. He is one of the founding and senior faculty members who is a part of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance. And we often at the Rock Center speak of a theme or an approach that we have, which is to take the anecdote of corporate governance, and corporate governance is full of anecdote. I liked how Chief Justice Steele phrased it as faith-based corporate governance. And we want to take that anecdote and we want to rigorously apply an empirical approach to evaluating data and understanding what is, as much as you can discern, the truth about hard questions in corporate governance. And no one does that better than Dave Larker, who we rely upon to do most of and much of our heavy lifting on the quantitative side, a broadly published scholar in all areas of corporate governance, and also sitting board member on the mutual fund for Wells Fargo, mutual fund group for Wells Fargo, and an experienced person who's spent a lot of time in boards and with board members. He is the perfect balance of scholar and person who has on-the-ground experience. And so with that, let me introduce Dave Larker. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm at the business school, and I wanted to highlight our new business campus. I'm also working in development for the room, too, so I'll be asking you for funds to finish paying off the debt. Now, if you get a chance, please walk over to the new business school. So I'd like to do, for a little bit today, maybe talk for 10, 15 minutes and open up for questions. I think you've been probably sitting long enough listening, and it's good to get a little more interaction. I want to talk about the proxy advisory industry, and what I'm obviously talking about is ISS, Glass Lewis, and a handful of smaller entities. We in the Rock Center, and let me just sort of highlight this a little bit, what we're trying to do is develop research, some conceptual, but mostly empirical to influence practice. We're trying to address things in a neutral and scientific manner. As you'll see, our assessment of the proxy advisory industry is not treated as neutral and as scientific by them as I think we treat it, but I'll let you judge that yourself. We obviously seek feedback and critique. We're not out muckraking. We're actually trying to kind of figure out whether this works or doesn't work. We make all our publications free and obviously look forward to your feedback. We publish and disseminate the results widely. You'll see these things in top-tier academic journals, but you'll also see these things in lots of public settings, newspapers, in business periodicals. And I guess the overriding mantra that we have is we want to get the story straight. One of the things that I personally detest, and I think we at the Rock Center all share, there's a lot of hype and rhetoric about corporate governance, blue ribbon panels, what works, what doesn't work, things like that. It sounds good, but ultimately it's a scientific question. Either it works or it doesn't. And so what we're trying to do is take a look at that. Now, admittedly, we haven't figured everything out, and it's a long kind of journey, but I think one area that we can bring some insight to bear is on the proxy advisory services. All right, so let me highlight one thing at the beginning. There clearly is a demand for proxy advisory services. There's a demand for all expert services that collect data, closely analyze it, and disseminate that so that informed consumers can make better decisions. Okay, and so you can imagine something like something as complicated as governance, where you have to collect a lot of data. You go out there and try to analyze what works and what doesn't work, that there would be a demand for that. Obviously, the mutual fund industry is a heavy consumer of these recommendations because they have to vote, thousands and thousands of proxies each year. And I'll circle back to that. But so it's not surprising that we see expert evaluations, bond raters. We can certainly debate how expert they've been, consumer reports, Zagat's, and the like. And one thing I'll highlight is relative to something like consumer reports, if they have bad information and you find out that you actually didn't like the refrigerator that you purchased, you stop subscribing to consumer reports. You don't view it. I think the proxy advisory services kind of fall into a gap where it's not so easy to walk away. And I think the research that we're doing accordingly has got some serious consequences. Again, as I pointed out, there's two primary players, ISS and Glass Lewis. ISS is an order of magnitude larger than Glass Lewis. Interestingly enough, to my knowledge, there's been no serious competition that's come into this industry in the last 7 or 8 years. so it is a duopoly in some sense. Some of the sessions I went to yesterday, ISS came up, and there was a lot of critique. Well, they've got data errors, they're not responsive, they have consulting conflicts. I think that's probably true, but I view that as like kind of smaller stuff. I mean, yeah, they will respond to errors, if things like that. It can be painful, but I think the real question is, do their voting recommendations actually enhance shareholder value? I mean, that's presumably what we're in business to do. At a mutual fund, our duty and the duty of all board members is to increase the value of the companies. And if we rely on these recommendations, we're making an implicit assumption that they're correct. So if I vote against or for, say, on pay, that actually tells me something about what's the right thing to do. So the underlying research question from our end, and I think the important practical question is, do these recommendations, in truth, are they correct? Do they help increase shareholder value or not? And so this is one of the research projects that we have here at the Rock Center. All right, let me before I get into the kind of the nitty-gritty of this, let me just sort of highlight some of the work we've done so far. And the first project that we did took a look at all the governance ratings that were produced by Corporate Library, Governance Metrics International, ISS, and the like. And we wanted to see whether these ratings, you got a 90 out of 100, or you got 22, or Berkshire Hathaway, their governance usually is rated about a 5 out of 100, where just so we're on the same page, 100 is good and 5 is bad. Okay, so and so we started taking a look at this, and we actually went out and presented this to the ISS board. And they had a product that was called the Corporate Governance Quotient, or CGQ. And basically, at the end of that board meeting, I won't name names, but one of the famous board members looked across to the chairman and said, "Looks like we have a bad product on the market." And they've actually yanked the CGQ off the market. Now, of course, what happens is CGQ is morphed into something else. You have to have some service offering to bring forward. And so and I'm sure you all know this, they have this grid rating system. And it's, quote, to help investors assess the level of governance related risk at portfolio companies. I think it's kind of interesting to think about what governance related risk is. I think that's probably everything, anything bad that could happen, but let me just hold that aside. And so these are, again, these checkbox sort of approaches, 60 to 80 questions. And you get 4 scores: audit, board, comp, and shareholder rights, which are basically anti-takeover things. And if you pull up Yahoo Finance for your company, you'll see, did you get a high concern or a medium concern or low concern? And what's kind of interesting, unlike the prior product, these principles here basically underlie the methodology that's used in the proxy voting. Now, I will admit that I don't know, because it just came out, whether the grid scores basically tell you anything. But I can assure you that the predecessor that was basically adding up these scores and providing some algorithm around these things, it had zero ability to predict anything of interest. It couldn't predict restatements, couldn't predict lawsuits, couldn't predict performance, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so at some level, again, I don't know about this one, but I'm very suspicious. And obviously, it's one thing that we'll dial up. These are freely available. Okay, but let me get into the heart. And this is kind of a precursor to this stream of research that we're doing. The role of proxy advisors is pretty serious now. And it's serious for a number of reasons, but there are 2 in particular. Most non-routine items on your proxy statement require a majority shareholder vote, okay? And it's become pretty specific. In a vote like that, shares held in street name after Reg 452 cannot be voted at all. Now, generally, they would be voted with management. And the companies we've looked at, that's around 20% of your vote. So right off the bat, you lose kind of 20% that would, generally speaking, be voted in your favor. Mutual funds can satisfy their fiduciary responsibility for voting by basically outsourcing the votes to third-party groups like ISS or Glass Lewis. Now, there's some debate about this. You know, does ISS, do they tell you how to vote? No, well, yes, but I mean, they're not actually making the vote. I mean, the actual vote is made by the mutual fund, but there's a fine line between I'm going to subscribe to this service, and if you look, most of the votes are consistent with that. The ISS pushback would be, well, we're not telling them how to vote. They're actually doing the vote, but I think it's a little bit of jargon. If a proxy advisor recommends against you, we find that swings about 30% of the vote. Now, of course, that varies a bit. If you stop and think about it, if you need majority passage, okay, out of, say, 100 votes, you lose 20 because they're held in street name. You got 30 that are not going to go in your favor. So what happens, I've just kind of done, this is kind of Joe's term, the voting calculus changes in a sense that you got to get 40 out of the remaining 50 that are available to pass. You got to have 40 out of the 80 votes to pass this thing. So, I mean, it puts a really high burden. And I've heard a number of people say, you know, I have to go out and do the road show with all the big institutions. And, you know, it's kind of, it clearly increases the cost of governance. Now, again, this may not be a bad thing. If what? If the recommendations are in fact correct, they create value and things like that. And so the underlying thing that we're looking at is that really true? All right, let me show you a little bit of examples around this. This kind of work is extremely difficult to do because generally there's not an available database that tells you what are all the votes and how did they actually make the recommendations. We've spent an enormous time, or maybe I should say my PhD students have spent an enormous amount of time trying to reverse engineer the algorithms that ISS and Glass Lewis are using. There are 100 pages of documents talking about how they do it, but there's all these little kludges that are embedded in there, and you actually can't get that close. And so one of the problems is these organizations are not transparent about what they do, which of course is an irony given that they're trying to impose transparency on the companies. Tell us more what you're doing, engage us in a dialogue, et cetera, et cetera. But they themselves, in my view, are not that transparent. So one area where you can get actually quite good data, and it has to do with stock option exchanges. Now, admittedly, these are highly controversial. These are cases where you have a bunch of stock options that are used. There's some event that occurs, maybe exogenous, maybe due to management, where prices collapse. So maybe you had a bunch of options at 20 and now you're selling at 5, okay? Is it a smart thing to go in and exchange out the options that are way out of the money with new ones that are in the money? Now, obviously, it's controversial because that's something shareholders can't do. On the other hand, the good part of that is you don't want to lose those managers. It may be the case that it was an exogenous event that occurred. You still have a good business model. You want to set the incentives correctly relative to what you had before. So most of these exchanges are recommended against, but not all. And here's a case where there's about 6 criteria that are used in these exchanges. So we know exactly what the criteria that are used by ISS are leading up to their voting recommendations, and we know the restrictions that have been in place on the proposal that's brought forward by the company. Okay, so it's a rare case. We know what ISS is looking for. We know what was chosen by the company. And so you can tell how constrained the stock option exchange is relative to the ISS criteria. All right, so these things are factors, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Are officers and directors excluded from the exchange? If they are, chances are you're going to get a favorable recommendation from ISS. Now, just personally, I find that to be a little odd, because whose incentives are you trying to change? Well, the people that hold most of the shares, the options, the senior executives. Is it a value for value exchange and things like that? But I mean, the point here is that we know exactly what the characteristics of the exchange offer are, and we also know what ISS recommends. So we can tell how close it is to ISS recommendations. Just a side issue. It is interesting when you look at the data, the companies that constrain themselves the most in these exchanges are companies where their institutional investors follow almost in lockstep the ISS voting recommendations. So in other words, the more exposure you have to the voting recommendations, the more likely you are to actually do something that would be consistent with ISS in some sense to get the positive vote. So in a nutshell, what we find is firms that constrain the exchange offer, in other words, eliminate officers and directors, the exchange and things like that. Companies that do that, they have a much lower stock price performance, lower future operating performance, and a much higher executive turnover. Now, I don't know if I want to go down the causal path as one of the panelists mentioned earlier, but it certainly is provocative that the more you follow the ISS recommendations, admittedly, for these stock option exchanges, the less positive the results are. And I guess our conclusion is these recommendations are not value increasing. Now, the issue is, well, that's the small thing. You looked at 263 exchanges. That's not that big a deal. Well, it'd be great to look at other features of this as well. Let me just sort of highlight this a little bit. There's been a tremendous amount on ISS say on pay alignment tests. I'm sure you've all spent many hours trying to figure out whether your plan is going to pass or not and whether you care. Here's the primary metric. 1 in 3 year TSR relative to industry groups compared to year-over-year change in expected compensation. It's like a lot of governance. I mean, it sounds like a good idea. Stock price went up or it went down. Your pay either went up or went down. And if they're not moving in the same direction, then there's a misalignment. There's a disconnection. I just don't. I don't know if I want to believe this or not. Right? I mean, a lot of times, if you're an oil company or something like that, you're looking at a 10-year, 20-year horizon, something like that. I mean, is TSR over 1 to 3 year appropriate? How do you actually want to compute compensation? This is the expected value of compensation, so you're valuing the options and things like that. If the stock price goes down and you got a lot of options, we know what's going to happen to your realized pay. It's going to be zero. Okay? So, I mean, whether this is the right metric or not, and there's lots of, if you read this, lots of inconsistencies around this. There are also so if your TSR, relative TSR goes down and your pay goes up, you're likely to get a negative vote. But even if you have what would be considered alignment on this part, you get an against vote you'll get an against vote if you've done repricing, you have excessive perquisites, you have tax gross ups, or you have a bunch of employment contracts that are considered improper. All right. Now, again, some of the I'm not a proponent of tax gross ups, for example, but do you want to wring out an against vote on an entire executive pay package based on whether tax gross ups exist or not? Maybe it is the key red flag, it's an indicator, things like that. But I find this to be kind of an interesting but kind of crude and naive way to think about pay using these metrics. And I guess the thing from our end is there any evidence these criteria actually work? So the study we're in the middle of right now is we have these criteria and we can map the voting recommendations of ISS almost exactly. We'd like to do Glass Lewis as well, except they won't share their data with us. So if you have any poll there, please see me after the small chat. And so you can do back testing. I mean, if we're running money, I mean, you have an idea about how you're going to generate so-called alpha, you back test this thing. Well, why don't you do the same thing with these recommendations? I mean, you have all the data. You can go backward in time and say, what if I apply these criteria to data in 2004, 2005, 2006? I mean, did they actually pick out the good guys and the bad guys? Okay? I mean, some back testing or some research would be a useful thing to do. Now, we're not done with this yet, but it looks to us at this point, if you apply these criteria going backward, you really can't predict very much. Okay? Now, again, it's kind of preliminary results, but I mean, this is an example of here's a case where research can be brought to bear on this. Is there a valid set of algorithms or rules that can be used? And I'm not sure in this industry why that testing is not done. I mean, we do it in medical research and other things. I mean, why don't we do it here? And it's not like the data are missing. All the data are available. So in some sense, I think hopefully we can start holding these firms to a higher standard. You've all seen this. I won't spend much time on this. Out here in the Valley, getting new stock option grants, extending your plan is a big deal. Every couple of years you ask for another tranche of options. One of the things that we've been trying to work on is the shareholder value transfer. And what this basically is what amount of the value of the company is subject to options, either granted or can be granted, options and restricted stock, in fact, all equity instruments. Now, if we're in private equity, this is clearly a big deal, right? You want to know what the dilution, what are you sharing and things like this. I don't have any problem with the idea, but this is the kind of thing I find very odd. So you're going to get an against vote if your shareholder value transfer as a percentage is higher than some benchmark. Now, the benchmark is computed as taking all the companies in your industry group and taking the top 25% in TSR and figuring out the median number of SVT. So what percent of the market value is under these equity plans. So if you're higher than that, you're going to get a vote against you. Now, that's something else, whether that threshold is the correct threshold or not, is you could figure out, right, whether that's the right thing. I mean, I don't kind of buy into the simple stories where it's like, well, here's the top quarter of your industry, and if it could do it for that level of SVT, you ought to be able to do it for the same level. I don't think that's true in a turnover situation and lots of situations. Depends on the people, the strategy, and things like that. I think jamming everybody into a specific algorithm or box like this just doesn't make sense. And again, this is an old story. Is there any evidence that these criteria actually enhance shareholder value? Again, this is something you could figure out with research if the data were shared. All right, let me conclude with this, and I'll open up for questions. So here's a prognostication. Yesterday in the paper, ISS announced that they're going to generate a new compensation database. So they're going to compete against, I'm sure many of you have met David Chun here, they're going to compete, I guess, directly with Equilar. All right? Now you think about that, that's got to be a costly thing to do. I'm sure they have staff and people and all that, but I mean, it seems like there must have been a deal to be cut without bearing all that fixed cost. So I haven't thought carefully about this, but I'll be interested in your opinion. So what happens if ISS becomes primarily a data provider? So they own KLD data, which is social responsibility data. They own Innovest, which is an environmental data company. And they own a bunch of data like that. Maybe they're starting to become a data provider. If I were them, I think what I would do is I'd eliminate voting recommendations from my offering. I mean, they catch all the abuse from people like me or the Rock Center by saying, these recommendations, where do they come from? Do they work, et cetera? I mean, and so, people in Congress are looking at this. And I think, well, if I were ISS, what would I do? And I think maybe what I would do is I'd stop making these public or quasi-public recommendations for companies. But what I'd do is I'd reconstitute myself, where what I would do is provide data to the mutual funds for their analysis to make their recommendations. And then I would also offer a service, which is expert consulting. I will help you, think through this thing. I'll bring our experts in, using our data to help you make recommendations. But ultimately, you're explicitly making the recommendations. We're helping you with the analysis, but we're no longer coming out saying, we're going to vote against say on pay at Hewlett-Packard, okay? We're going to go into the mutual funds and sit down and say, here's the data, here's how we would do it, here's some alternatives, you choose. And I think what would happen is, I think, you'd be out from underneath this public scrutiny of making these recommendations. And it's sort of like a compensation consultant. They come in with data, they have recommendations, kind of expert opinions, but it's not like they're coming out and saying, I'm voting for or against these pay packages. So I don't know, just as a guess, maybe interesting to talk about. I think if we eliminate these public responses about voting, I don't know, maybe that removes a lot of controversy from ISS. You're still doing the same thing, but they're basically, not in this quandary of companies complaining. ISS recommended a no recommendation. They're doing it implicitly by having that conversation with all the mutual funds that are in their clients. So that's sort of my talk. Let me open it up for questions about ISS. No questions? This is always a bad sign. Yes?
Our experience is that ISS can make mistakes, and being on the receiving end of their evaluation, we found that being on the receiving end of a poor evaluation, we found it oftentimes difficult to actually communicate and get them to recognize their mistake. Any advice that you can give in those types of situations based on your experience with them?
Not really. I mean, I view them as a professional organization. I mean, they got a big job. They're going through, I don't know, 10,000 proxies. My feeling is that they are responsive to correcting errors. I mean, I know that they have electronic access where you can look at your data and correct it and things like that. But yeah, I mean, that's a typical slam that, they have a lot of errors in there. But I view them as professional along those lines. I believe that they will correct those things. But yeah, there are some hoops to jump through, certainly. Yes, in the middle.
So how do you implement some of these changes you have here? Because my concern is the clout that these organizations are starting to develop, especially with some of the institutional votes where they're following them very closely, if not blindly, into these things. And the policies that they're starting to represent that are being followed. To me, it's a scary trend.
I absolutely agree. I mean, this is the reason why we're kind of doing the research. I mean, there's always a lot of one-off sort of statements out there. Yeah, I'm sure they're true, but I mean, what we're looking at is more systemically, what actually is happening. But at some level, let's say we could start conclusively providing evidence saying, look, this just doesn't work. I mean, at some level, somebody's got to step up, either the mutual funds or I don't think this is necessarily a good idea, but maybe government, and sort of say, look, this fulfills your fiduciary responsibility, but there's a lot of evidence that these recommendations are not correct. I mean, at some point, you'd think the market mechanism would start operating. But I grant you the point. They're very powerful. And, obviously, we talk to these groups, although it's usually, how should we say, a more adversarial as opposed to friendly sort of discussion. But, I mean, our goal, in truth, like I said on the first slide, is get the story straight. What works and what doesn't work. And I come from the hard science background, and I view it as an empirical issue. Does it work or doesn't it, or under what circumstances does it work or doesn't it? I mean, the problem that I have with these recommendations, there's no context and it's not nuanced. I mean, I can certainly imagine separating CEO and chairman is a good thing in some circumstances and really a bad thing in other circumstances. The problem is we're jamming everybody in the same box. It was in the prior panel. I can imagine diversity is a good thing for some companies, and in other companies it's not. I mean, it's not about discrimination. It's just a matter of, how does that board operate? The problem in governance is we're looking for the simple solutions, and I think you got to think more carefully about that. And I shouldn't do this, but we have a new book that talks about that. So it's a great gift for Christmas, holidays, whatever. Yeah, yes.
I'm surprised you don't have another point on your prediction there, which is the calculus remains the same, but now it's invisible to us.
Well, that was what I was implying. Yeah, but I mean, maybe I'm dead wrong about that, but I gotta believe. I think we'd all agree. I mean, I get the allegation, like, you don't believe in America and governance and apple pie and stuff. I say that's not the point. I absolutely believe in governance, and I absolutely believe that good governance matters. Okay, the issue is, would you know it if you saw it, or, okay, what is it actually? What is it actually? What are the processes? I also don't believe that examine what I call looking at the company from the outside. You know, how many people are quote unquote independent, or how many people missed a meeting, that kind of stuff. You know, it's kind of loose data, but you know, the evidence is pretty clear. Those things don't correlate very much with things of interest, okay? I mean, ultimately, you gotta meet the people, go inside the companies. Now, the problem is there's no business model there, right? I mean, you can't go in and visit with 10,000 companies. It's just impossible to do. But at some level, if you're on the outside looking in, how much can you actually assess about governance? Yeah, maybe there are magic red flags that we can come up with. I'm unaware of those things. But I mean, ultimately, I think it's the context and the nuances and careful thinking that's necessary. I think we need fewer blue ribbon panels and fewer, much less government regulation on these topics. Where's the microphone? Yeah.
Dave, you mentioned your book, and as you know, I've had the opportunity and pleasure to read your whole book and study it, and it is a great book. He was joking from his chair, but I'd say I've first time I've ever purchased copies for everybody of my board of any book. It's a great book and has a lot of data like this, so I highly recommend it personally.
I had to pay Ellen about, how many, $10,000?
And I'm still waiting for payment. If that's true, I'd be happy to receive it.
That's governance,
But my question goes more to, and you just mentioned the bad business model, frankly, of the ISS, et cetera. And it struck me for years that their business model encompasses, and they clearly engage in, they have to come out with a new product every time. So here's our new recommendation on something boards should do, and they seem to be based on a conceptual ideology, and again, as you show, not on facts. Can you speak to that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, new things crop up every year, and you know, the model evolves. Yeah, and obviously, you don't have to be too much of an academic or a business person to say you can't sell the same thing every year if it's not going to change, right? And so there has to be some variation in that. But yeah, I mean, the business model is such that it almost has to be a simple summarization of things that are observable. You know, do you have a staggered board? Is your CEO's pay more than 3 times higher than the number 2 guy? Whatever these things are. And otherwise, you just can't do this kind of modeling. But then I think it does change over time. I mean, you know, if I were running it, I think I would, try to do the back testing, and then try to see what worked, but then adapt it over time, where you'd have more prediction of this thing called governance risk. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly an interesting business model. I mean, but I guess just going forward, hopefully, we can collectively push it into more of a research setting where, the business model changes, but for kind of the right reasons. Yes.
How does the Wells Fargo mutual funds vote their proxies?
I don't think I'm going to comment on that because I'm on the Wells Fargo Advantage Fund board. But I can say we subscribe to these services, and let me just leave it at that. But let me talk more generally. We've actually, in the book, we actually compute this. What are the percentage of times when ISS recommends something different than management, okay? And by fund, what's the percent of time that they follow ISS versus the management? And so you can kind of get a feeling for what the, what your shareholder base, how it actually is voting along with that. But there's no question that the funds vote the proxies. Okay, well, or ISS, Glass Lewis does not vote the proxies, okay? But we take, as input, these recommendations. But every fund will have a special group that evaluates especially controversial things. So something like ratification of the auditor, things like that, not controversial. But, it'd be rare to go into a fund. I think BlackRock I believe they had 18 people in their proxy voting group full-time. I think they run now something like 2.3, 2.5 trillion. But even that, I mean, think about the tasks that you have to go through. So I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, the problem is that even if you wanted to get serious, a fund really wanted to get serious about this, you have this collective action problem, which is maybe you own 0.5% of a company, so, and you bear all the cost, well, you're going to get 0.5% of the benefit. So there's obviously an economic problem there. But I mean, I think that solution, I think, is an interesting one. But sort of as I talked at the beginning, there's clearly a demand for expert knowledge here. I mean, you'd want to share the fixed cost of doing this, and I think that's a good thing. The thing I'm questioning is, are these recommendations that are being made, are they in fact the right ones? And from my perspective, I don't know, all right? But we are pushed down the path where we're actually researching that, and hopefully that'll be embedded in some of these recommendations going forward. But yeah, that's actually all I want to say about Wells Fargo. Yeah. Yes.
Have you just done an ISS-like evaluation of ISS?
The evaluation? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if the exact numbers, but ISS was sold to MSCI fairly recently, I believe for $1.4 billion. Chris, you would know that, right? Was it? 500 million? And Glass Lewis was sold to Ontario teachers for, do you remember? I don't know. It was a much smaller number, but yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Used ISS-like criteria and looked at ISS themselves, how would they rate?
Oh, they've done that. When they were publicly traded, yeah, I mean, for the most part, they satisfied all the criteria. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's called in the real world dog fooding, right? Yeah, so, yes.
Your analysis is an absolute analysis. Is there a relative analysis? In other words, do regular shareholders who don't follow ISS do any better or worse than shareholders who follow ISS at predicting shareholder value increases?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. The study that I did do, and was in the Financial Times a few years ago, was what if you farmed a portfolio, let's say you ran money against these recommendations, you don't find anything. And if anything, it seemed to go the other way. But again, I don't want to push that too far. But yeah, I mean, you can imagine the group that we have researching this, we're game to analyze all things like that, yeah, yeah. Other things? I don't know. I guess we're running late. Thank you for being here.